Hey there folks, it's me TheTacticalBrit, and Rush has returned to Battlefield 5 with some necessary changes, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about my new experience with this update and some of the hits and misses we're seeing here with Battlefield in terms of Rush at the moment. Now, bearing in mind, Rush has always been a cornerstone of Battlefield, I'd argue in the future, if they were ever to make a Battlefield game that was a bit more refined, I'd simply launch the game with Conquest and Rush only, because they are the bread and butter of the franchise. So, making sure that this mode is done right in Battlefield 5 for me has always been pretty important. So, as a quick recap, they've basically identified areas where they felt that Rush could improve, namely sectors being too wide and allowing too much hidden flanking and backcapping, and being too short in length. Now, if you think about traditional Rush, the play areas themselves were never particularly wide, but they certainly had a very long sense to them. Each sector definitely had some depth to it, so you could chew your way through the sector slowly but surely. And this appears to have been justified and changed, and it looks really good so far, and from what I've played, having much more narrow sectors, but, you know, definitely more lengthwise sectors has certainly worked in favour of Rush. I felt that the defenders had much more of a chance to defend because there was less flanking routes, and the attackers didn't necessarily have an unnecessary advantage in that sense. But it definitely meant that the attackers had to resort to things like smoke grenades and everything else to really make a push here. And I feel like we're getting a much better representation of Rush in the sense that it was always about defenders digging in, and it was always about attackers making really logical calls like smoke grenades in order to make objectives happen. And there actually has been some adjustments as well to the maps themselves, which has been pretty cool. You know, I really like that. You can see that some of the frameworks on things like Devastation have returned. There's definitely been some cover added in places, and ultimately I feel like it's been a much more fluid and more functional experience in the game so far. And what I've noticed as well is it's very much dawned upon me that we're starting to see Rush as it was, because previously when you played games like Rush, you know, you could be absolutely destroying an enemy and then you'd get to that one MCOM where they just held it down. And I've started to notice things like that, which has been really great for me to see. I really appreciate this sort of kind of make it like Battlefield 3-esque kind of version of Rush, and I think that's what I've really enjoyed. Other changes include that the animation in terms of planting and defusing has been sped up to feel a little less sluggish, and the big artillery cannons where the MCOMs are actually smaller now, so you could read the space around the objective without being camped on by surprise enemies, because a big problem was people laying on these giant cannons and just getting away with daylight robbery. They've also reduced and adjusted in some places the amount of tanks in the mode. Due to the fact that it's 32 players in a more narrow space, there was a real question of balance around how many tanks had. So in Twisted Steel, for example, the attackers get a tank in the early sectors and the defenders get one in the last sector, whereas Devastation just doesn't support tank gameplay at all, which makes sense because, again, Rush for me has always been the Bad Company 2/Battlefield 3 days, where it was purely one transport vehicle or a couple of transport vehicles that made the difference, and I'm really glad that we've seen this changed. I'm really glad that some of the layout changes and map adjustments have been made as well. I think a lot of you guys will notice that there's been a bit more fluidity between the objectives, and one thing I've really liked seeing is that we're starting to see objectives both next to each other side by side, but also stacked above and behind each other, and I think that really mixes up the dynamic in certain kind of areas. You know, sometimes when they're right next to each other, it feels very like a wall against a wall, where the defenders are just a wall of gunfire and the attackers are a wall of gunfire. But when they're stacked behind each other, there's the opportunity for some wide flanks, less so in the new layouts, but certainly still possible to make those kind of attacks and be a bit more sneaky, and I really think that that's a better representation of what we've seen in Rush. So on the whole, with some splashings of new layouts, some adjustments to the maps and some new fortifications, I think Rush is in a pretty good state in Battlefield 5 at the moment, but I do still have some gripes and some serious concerns. I feel like there are certain areas of the map that simply are still lacking a lot of cover, and as well, what I've really noticed is that the artillery strikes are still prevalent in the game. So, in summary, in certain areas like Twisted Steel and in Devastation, I feel like there are stretches of land, and in Narvik as well, where attackers are almost forced to use large stretches of land, and even if they throw down smoke grenades, they still don't have any serious hard cover to make a push, and I think that that can become a problem in the future. I don't think it's been too big now, but the more I played Rush, the more I noticed that there'd be times where I would just be in a large stretch of open space and everything would immediately turn to shit because somebody had an MG or somebody had a sniper rifle, and even if I threw down 3-4 smoke grenades, there was still that option of, you know, there is no hard cover here, I'm going to get destroyed. And I think that's a little bit disappointing. I'd really like to see some changes on that behalf, and hopefully that's something that we see eventually. But all in all, it wasn't too bad. I think you could still make pretty ample pushes, but you really need the right teammates for it because most of them won't use like smoke grenades and stuff. I had one game where I had a team using a whole barrage of them on every objective, which was great. I had another team where I effectively had to do it myself, otherwise we weren't going to get anywhere. So, you know, the same old Rush problems that we've always had, but nothing particularly new or particularly to Battlefield 5. Now, one big issue I've noticed is the artillery. Now, there has been some changes in this sense. So, number one, there is no longer any random artillery from the defensive MCOMs. So before you could run up to them, hold E, and it would fire artillery rounds at spotted enemies. That's completely gone now. It was very cheap, and I'm glad that mechanic has disappeared. But there still does exist some sector artillery, and it has been delayed. So it'll only now trigger at certain stages in the map, which is usually the latter or last stage. And although I think this is a pretty good way of trying to reduce the impact it has, you still end up with a situation where everybody suddenly realizes they have enough points for sector artillery in the last sector and decides to activate it. And I think there was one game in particular where I had like 3 back-to-back and it was just a nightmare, and everybody was dying and it was really confusing. And I think it just completely shook up the balance of the game in not a positive way, because I feel like everybody who had worked very hard to get to that last objective had now had that kind of ripped away from them very quickly. So ultimately, I think Rush has been improved, and it's a nice addition to Battlefield again. I really do hope it stays for a longer while, because apparently at the moment it's only a week, but you know, it's been nice to do something a little bit fresh, and I feel like with the state Battlefield's in at the moment, and honestly, I do believe it is losing players by the large numbers every single day. Something like Rush staying in rotation would be a nice change. Anywho, folks, that's it from me, the Tactical Brit. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you again in another video.